On the morning of April 20th, 1999, a seemingly ordinary Tuesday, the hallways of Columbine High School were filled with the familiar sounds of lockers slamming shut, hurried footsteps and teenage conversations about tests, sports and after-school plans. The Colorado sky was clear, the air still carrying the chill of early spring, and nothing in that peaceful setting suggested that within the next hour the school would become the center of a tragedy that would permanently redefine the meaning of safety inside American classrooms. Students laughed around cafeteria tables, teachers prepared materials for upcoming lessons, and staff members moved through their daily routines as if this day would be no different from any other. Some teenagers worried about unfinished homework. Others counted the minutes until lunch, and many had absolutely no idea they were experiencing their final moments of normalcy. Routine, predictable and comforting, was about to be shattered by violence on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Outside in the parking lot, cars slowly arrived and departed. Among them were two vehicles that looked completely ordinary, indistinguishable from every other student car parked on campus. Inside those vehicles, however, were improvised, explosive devices powerful enough to turn the school into a mass casualty seen within seconds. This was not meant to be just a shooting. It was designed to be something far more catastrophic, far more calculated, and infinitely more destructive. The architects of that plan were two senior students known to some classmates, ignored by many, and truly understood by almost no one: Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. They were not panicking, not hesitating, and not showing any visible signs of fear. Witnesses would later describe their behavior as eerily calm, almost methodical, as if they were simply carrying out a task they had rehearsed countless times. For more than a year, they had been planning every detail. They built homemade bombs, obtained weapons illegally, studied the school's schedule, and even anticipated how emergency responders would likely react. In their minds, the goal was not merely to kill. It was to create an event of historic magnitude, something that would eclipse previous school attacks and etch their names permanently into the national consciousness. Shortly after 11 in the morning, as students began heading toward lunch, the final phase of the plan was set into motion. Backpacks that looked perfectly normal were carried into the building and left inside the crowded cafeteria, positioned strategically to maximize casualties. Had everything worked as intended, the explosions alone could have killed hundreds instantly, followed by gunfire directed at anyone who managed to escape the blast. But something went wrong. The main bombs never detonated. That failure did not stop the attack. It only changed its form. Minutes later, the ordinary silence of a school day was torn apart by the unmistakable sound of gunfire, sharp, violent cracks that did not belong in a place meant for learning. In that moment, reality fractured. Some students believed it was a prank. Others thought construction noises were echoing through the halls, and many simply froze, unable to process what they were hearing. Within seconds, confusion spread across the campus. Teachers tried to interpret the noise, staff members rushed to investigate, and no one yet understood that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the deadliest school massacres in modern history. What would unfold over the next 49 minutes would not only destroy lives but also permanently change how schools, law enforcement, and entire societies respond to the threat of mass violence. Security policies would shift, public debates would ignite, and the name Columbine would become synonymous with a nightmare no community ever wants to experience. And as the chaos began to escalate, almost no one realized that this was not an impulsive act of rage. It was the final step of a long descent fueled by resentment, violent fantasy, and obsessive preparation. A descent that had begun long before that quiet spring morning. Looking back, the warning signs were there. Almost all of them. No one imagined where they would lead. The original blueprint for the attack was not a shooting rampage. It was mass annihilation. The two perpetrators had envisioned explosions ripping through the cafeteria at the busiest moment of the day, collapsing floors, igniting fires, and forcing terrified survivors into open areas where they could be targeted from outside. The scale of destruction, they imagined, rivaled acts of terrorism rather than school violence. When the bombs failed to detonate, however, the plan did not collapse, it transformed. Standing outside the building, armed and waiting, they realized the devices had not exploded. There was no fireball, no structural collapse, no screaming wave of panic pouring out of the exits. For a brief moment, the world continued as if nothing had happened. Students inside were still eating lunch, laughing, talking, completely unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. That silence, that absence of chaos, forced an immediate decision. If the bombs would not bring devastation, gunfire would. The first shots rang out near the west entrance, echoing across the campus and into nearby neighborhoods of Littleton. At first, confusion dominated. Some students thought it might be senior pranks, construction noise, or even fireworks. The idea that classmates were deliberately shooting people was almost too horrifying to accept in real time. Seconds passed before fear began to replace disbelief. Panic erupted unevenly. Some students ran instinctively. Others froze, and many simply looked around, searching for guidance from teachers who themselves had no clear understanding of what was happening. The attackers moved with disturbing purpose, firing repeatedly, not in a frenzy but in controlled bursts. Witnesses would later recall that their expressions appeared detached, almost emotionless, as if they were carrying out a rehearsed scenario rather than reacting spontaneously. Teachers shouted for students to get down, to run, to hide. Conflicting commands born from uncertainty. Windows became escape routes, hallways turned into danger zones, and classrooms transformed into improvised shelters. The ordinary architecture of a high school suddenly became a maze of life or death decisions. Every corner could conceal safety or fatal exposure. Outside, the sound of sirens began to rise, distant at first, then multiplying as emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. Reports were chaotic and often contradictory. Explosions, multiple shooters, injuries, possibly hostages. Law enforcement had no clear picture, only the certainty that something catastrophic was unfolding. Time, however, was moving faster than any coordinated response could. Inside the school, the attackers continued deeper into the building, leaving behind scenes of devastation that would later shock even seasoned investigators. The failure of the bombs meant the violence would unfold face to face, room by room, victim by victim. What might have been a single catastrophic blast was becoming something slower, more personal, and in many ways more terrifying. For those trapped inside, every second stretched into eternity. The sounds of gunfire echoed unpredictably, sometimes close, sometimes distant, making it impossible to determine where safety might be. Whispers replaced conversation. Breathing felt dangerously loud. Many students later described an overwhelming realization settling in. This was not going to end quickly. And as the attackers advanced toward one of the most crowded areas in the school, a place meant for quiet study and refuge, the situation was about to reach a level of horror that would define the tragedy in the public memory for decades. The library doors were ahead, and inside, dozens of students were hiding. Inside the library, the atmosphere had already shifted from routine to dread long before the attackers entered. Students who had heard distant gunfire rushed in seeking safety, believing the thick walls, bookshelves, and study tables would shield them from whatever chaos was unfolding outside. Some hid beneath desks, others crouched behind computer stations, and a few remained frozen in place, trying to understand whether the sounds were real or imagined. The fire alarm blared relentlessly, filling the room with a mechanical scream that made communication nearly impossible and amplified the sense of unreality. When the doors finally opened, the illusion of safety shattered instantly. The attackers stepped inside with weapons raised, scanning the room not with panic, but with a chilling deliberation. Survivors would later describe how the energy in the room seemed to collapse inward, as if hope itself had been pulled out through the doorway. What followed was not random chaos, but a sequence of calculated movements. Reloading, advancing, searching and firing again. They moved between tables, forcing students out of hiding or shooting toward any movement they detected. Some victims attempted to remain perfectly still, believing that silence might render them invisible. Others whispered prayers, clutched hands, or tried to comfort friends despite their own terror. The library, once a place of quiet concentration, had become a landscape of fear where every sound could draw fatal attention. At one table, a wounded student tried to crawl away, leaving a trail that marked their desperate attempt to survive. At another, several students pressed themselves flat against the floor, barely breathing as footsteps approached, and then moved away again. The attackers' voices cut through the alarm, sometimes mocking, sometimes casual, as though they were commenting on an ordinary event rather than committing mass murder. This dissonance between tone and action would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. In the midst of the horror, moments of incomprehensible randomness occurred. One student, recognizing one of the attackers, spoke his name in disbelief. The response was brief, almost distracted, followed by a command to leave. Against all expectations, the student was allowed to escape, stumbling out of the library into a corridor still echoing with gunfire. For many inside, that moment reinforced the terrifying unpredictability of the situation. Survival did not follow logic. Gunshots continued to erupt at close range, the sound deafening within the enclosed space. Books were shredded, computers destroyed, windows shattered. The physical environment itself seemed to disintegrate under the violence. Yet amid the destruction, dozens of students remained alive, hidden beneath furniture, behind cabinets, or shielded by the bodies of others. Later investigations would reveal that the attackers still possessed enough ammunition to kill everyone in the room, a fact that deepened the sense of incomprehensible chance surrounding who lived and who died. As minutes passed, the intensity began to shift. Witnesses would later recall hearing the attackers speak in tones that suggested fatigue, even boredom, as if the adrenaline that had fueled the assault was fading. The brutality had not ended, but something in their demeanor had changed, foreshadowing a transition that no one inside could yet understand. Then, just as suddenly as they had entered, their attention moved elsewhere in the room, toward the administrative counter at the far side of the library, where new destruction was about to unfold. Near the administrative counter, the attackers slowed their pace, as if the momentum that had driven them through the library was beginning to dissipate. Survivors hidden beneath tables would later recall a strange shift in the atmosphere. The gunfire became less frequent, replaced by footsteps, metallic clicks of reloading, and fragments of conversation that drifted across the room. For those still alive, the uncertainty was almost worse than the violence. Every second stretched into something unbearable, a suspended moment between life and death. One wounded student lay motionless, barely conscious, listening to the attackers move only a few feet away. Another clutched a friend's hand so tightly that their fingers would later be bruised for days. The fire alarm still wailed, but now it sounded distant, as if coming from another world entirely. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by thin beams of light from shattered windows, turning the room into a haze of floating debris and silence punctuated by sudden noise. At the counter, the attackers hurled an incendiary device toward the far end of the library. It skidded across the floor but failed to ignite properly, leaving only a faint chemical smell and a thin trail of smoke. The failed explosion created a moment of eerie anticlimax, as though even destruction itself was faltering. Frustration replaced intensity. One of them circled behind the counter while the other approached from the opposite side, their movements slow, deliberate, almost aimless. Nearby, an injured student was discovered hiding behind furniture. Instead of immediately firing, the attackers taunted him, forcing him to show his face. He partially complied, revealing just enough to prove he was alive while still trying to conceal his identity. What followed was not an execution, but a chilling exchange of insults and humiliation, a reminder that psychological terror had become as central as physical violence. After a brief debate between them, they unexpectedly chose to leave him alive and moved away, their laughter fading into the noise of the alarm. By now, blood loss and physical exhaustion were taking visible tolls. One attacker's nose was bleeding heavily, and witnesses later speculated that this injury may have contributed to their decision to leave the library. Before exiting, one final shot was fired into an adjacent room, shattering a small television and sending sparks across the floor. Another act of destruction without a clear target, as if the violence had become unfocused. At approximately 11:36 in the morning, they walked out of the library, ending the most lethal phase of the attack inside that room. For the survivors, however, the nightmare was far from over. No one knew whether the attackers would return. For several long minutes, many remained frozen in place, too afraid to move, convinced that any sound might draw them back. Gradually, the injured and unhurt began to crawl, limp or carry one another toward the exit. Some left trails of blood across the floor. Others supported friends who could no longer walk. A few victims, unconscious or too severely wounded to move, remained behind as the exodus unfolded around them. Outside the doors, fresh air mixed with sirens and shouted commands, signals that the outside world was finally responding. But inside the building, the attackers were still moving, still armed, and still searching for whatever came next. After leaving the library, the attackers did not flee the building. Instead, they moved deeper into the school, wandering through hallways that only minutes earlier had been filled with students changing classes. Now the corridors were nearly empty, lined with abandoned backpacks, overturned trash cans, and the lingering echo of alarms that refused to stop. The silence between gunshots felt unnatural, like the building itself was holding its breath. They entered the science wing and tossed a small explosive device into a tea storage cabinet. The blast ignited a brief fire, sending smoke curling into the hallway. A teacher hiding nearby quickly extinguished the flames, preventing what could have become a much larger disaster. The attackers did not stay to watch. They continued moving, firing sporadically into empty rooms, as if searching for targets that no longer existed. Security cameras later captured their return to the cafeteria. The footage showed one of them kneeling on the staircase, aiming deliberately at a large propane bomb they had planted earlier in the day. He fired a single shot, attempting to trigger a detonation powerful enough to collapse the room. Nothing happened. The device remained intact, a silent failure that would later be recognized as the reason hundreds of students survived. Moments later, the other attacker approached the bomb, studied it briefly, and lit an improvised incendiary device. He tossed it onto the tank before stepping back. Seconds passed. Then a sudden burst of flame erupted, partially igniting the device but not producing the catastrophic explosion they had planned. Fire spread across the floor, feeding on spilled fuel until the building's sprinkler system activated, drenching the cafeteria and extinguishing the blaze. Water cascaded from the ceiling, washing away smoke and soot, turning the scene into a surreal mixture of destruction and mechanical calm. As they left the cafeteria again, they resumed their aimless movement through the main hallways, occasionally firing at walls, lockers, or empty spaces. Several times they stopped outside classroom doors, peering through narrow windows. Inside, students and teachers remained absolutely still, pressing themselves against walls, desks, and floors, terrified that even a whisper could reveal their presence. Eye contact was made more than once through the glass, a silent confrontation between predator and prey. Yet, inexplicably, the attackers did not attempt to enter. Near one classroom, they paused to reload their weapons, just outside the room where a wounded teacher lay bleeding. Despite being only a few steps away, they never opened the door. The randomness of their actions made survival feel arbitrary, dependent not on hiding skill or luck alone, but on decisions that even they seemed unable to explain. They continued toward the main office, then doubled back, retracing their path through the north corridor. At one point, they stopped outside a restroom where students were hiding and shouted through the door that they knew people were inside. Panic surged among those trapped within, but the door was never opened. After a moment of tense silence, footsteps faded, leaving only the relentless drone of alarms behind. By late morning, the attack had transformed into something different, no longer a targeted assault, but a wandering storm of violence moving unpredictably through an empty building. Outside, police were gathering in force, unaware that inside, the attackers were still alive, still armed, and still capable of causing unimaginable harm. By the morning of September 12th, the scale of the attack had begun to crystallize. Investigators now believed that 19 hijackers had carried out the operation, divided into coordinated teams across 4 flights. Their names surfaced quickly, many linked to extremist networks already known to intelligence agencies. The realization was chilling. This had not been a spontaneous act of terror, but a meticulously planned military-style operation executed with precision. Evidence recovered from airport security footage, passenger manifests, and recovered personal items painted a disturbing picture of calm preparation. Some hijackers had checked bags normally, passed through security without incident, and boarded as if they were ordinary travelers. To the outside world, they had blended in perfectly. Authorities soon identified the group as operatives connected to Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, a name that had appeared in previous intelligence briefings, but had never before been associated with an attack of this magnitude on US soil. The enemy was no longer abstract. It had a structure, leadership, funding, training camps, and a clear ideological motive. Meanwhile, investigators worked against time, fearing additional attacks. Airports across the country remained closed. Fighter jets patrolled American skies. Government buildings were evacuated or placed under heavy guard. For the first time in modern history, the continental United States operated as if it were a battlefield. What disturbed officials most was how long the plot had been developing. Financial records, flight school enrollments, visa histories, and communications suggested years of preparation. The attackers had studied aviation systems, security weaknesses, and emergency response protocols in extraordinary detail. This was not chaos, and it was strategy. For families of the victims, these revelations brought a new kind of pain. The loss was no longer just tragic. It was intentional, calculated, engineered. Every life taken had been part of a plan designed to maximize shock, destruction, and global attention. Across the nation, grief began to merge with anger. Candlelight vigils filled public squares. Churches, synagogues, and mosques opened their doors for prayer. Strangers embraced one another in silence. A shared question hung in the air. How could something like this happen here? As the investigation expanded beyond US borders, the world braced for what might come next. The attacks were no longer just a crime scene. They were the opening move in a conflict whose consequences no one yet understood. Within hours, governments around the globe began implementing emergency security measures. Airports from London to Tokyo shut down flights bound for the United States. Military forces in multiple countries moved to heightened readiness. Unsure whether the attacks were part of a broader coordinated campaign, intelligence agencies scrambled to assess whether additional cells might already be in position. In Europe, armed patrols appeared at train stations, government buildings, and major landmarks. In Asia and the Middle East, security services monitored suspected extremist groups around the clock. The fear was no longer confined to American soil. It had become global. World leaders issued statements of shock and solidarity. British Prime Minister Tony Blair pledged unwavering support to the United States. French President Jacques Chirac declared that France stood shoulder to shoulder with the American people. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin ordered immediate cooperation between Russian intelligence and US agencies. Even nations with strained relations with Washington condemned the attacks as crimes against humanity. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, passing a resolution that recognized the attacks as a threat to international peace and security. NATO took the unprecedented step of invoking Article 5 of its founding treaty, the C, Collective Defense Clause, for the first time in its history. An attack on one member, they declared, was an attack on all. Meanwhile, global financial markets reacted with panic. Stock exchanges in several countries suspended trading to prevent collapse. Oil prices surged amid fears of war in the Middle East. Airlines worldwide faced immediate crisis as passengers canceled travel en masse, terrified of flying. Back in the United States, Americans watched these developments unfold on continuous news coverage. For many, the realization that the entire world was responding underscored the enormity of what had occurred. This was no longer just a national tragedy. It was a turning point in global history. Security at US borders tightened dramatically. Visa procedures were reviewed, Intelligence sharing expanded, and counter-terrorism units mobilized at levels not seen before. The country was preparing not only to defend itself, but to pursue those responsible wherever they might be hiding. For ordinary people across continents, daily life suddenly felt fragile. Parents hesitated to send children to school. Public events were cancelled. Skyscrapers once seen as symbols of progress now felt like potential targets. The sense of vulnerability was universal. In the absence of clear answers, rumors spread quickly. Reports of suspicious packages, possible secondary attacks, and unverified threats. Many proved false, but they fueled an atmosphere of anxiety that seemed to penetrate every corner of society. The attacks had not only destroyed buildings and taken lives, they had shattered the illusion of safety that defined the post-Cold War era. The world had entered a new and uncertain chapter, one defined by invisible enemies and unpredictable dangers. For the first time in American history, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered a complete shutdown of U.S. airspace. Every civilian aircraft in the sky was instructed to land immediately at the nearest airport. Regardless of destination, more than 4,000 planes were forced to divert, creating chaos in airports across North America. Fighter jets patrolled the skies over major cities, authorized to intercept any aircraft that failed to respond to commands. The possibility that additional hijacked planes might still be airborne was taken with deadly seriousness. Military pilots were prepared for the unthinkable, to shoot down a civilian airliner if necessary to prevent another catastrophic strike. Commercial aviation came to a standstill. Airports that normally bustled with thousands of travelers fell eerily silent. Departure boards filled with cancellations. Runways sat empty under cloudless skies, a sight few had ever witnessed before. In Canada, Operation Yellow Ribbon was launched to accommodate dozens of diverted international flights. Small towns suddenly found themselves hosting thousands of stranded passengers from around the world. Local residents opened homes, schools and community centers, offering food, blankets, and comfort to people who had no idea when they would be able to continue their journeys. Inside the grounded planes, passengers waited for hours, cut off from reliable information. Rumors circulated through cabins, more attacks, bombs in other cities, unknown threats still unfolding. Flight attendants struggled to maintain calm while knowing as little as the passengers themselves. Across the United States, families watched the empty skies with a mix of relief and dread. Relief that no more planes could be turned into weapons. Dread at the realization of how vulnerable the nation had been just hours earlier. Cargo transport halted as well, disrupting supply chains almost instantly. Critical goods, including medical supplies and industrial components, were delayed nationwide. The economic impact began to ripple outward, affecting businesses large and small. Airlines faced unprecedented financial losses. Within days, the federal government would move to stabilize the industry, recognizing that commercial aviation was not only an economic pillar, but also a symbol of national connectivity. For many Americans, the absence of contrails overhead became one of the most haunting visual memories of the day. The skies, once crowded with routine travel, now felt ominously empty, as if the country itself were holding its breath. When flights eventually resumed under drastically tightened security measures, air travel would never feel routine again. Long lines, intensive screenings, and heightened vigilance became the new normal, permanent reminders of how the attacks had transformed everyday life. The shutdown of the skies was not just a logistical decision, it was a stark acknowledgement that the rules of safety had changed overnight, and that the nation was entering an era defined by caution, surveillance, and the constant anticipation of unseen threats. When financial markets opened after the attacks, fear translated instantly into economic shock. The New York Stock Exchange remained closed for several days, the longest shutdown since the Great Depression, as authorities assessed damage to infrastructure and the safety of traders in Lower Manhattan. When trading finally resumed, billions of dollars in market value evaporated within hours. Airline stocks collapsed first, reflecting the immediate paralysis of global travel. Insurance companies braced for unprecedented claims. Tourism, hospitality, and transportation sectors faced sudden and severe uncertainty. Wall Street itself had been physically damaged. Offices were destroyed, communication lines severed, and thousands of financial professionals displaced. Backup trading floors were activated in other cities as firms scrambled to maintain operations under emergency conditions. The Federal Reserve moved quickly to inject liquidity into the banking system, aiming to prevent a financial freeze. Interest rates were cut, and emergency funding mechanisms were deployed to reassure markets that the financial system would continue to function. Small businesses near the World Trade Center suffered catastrophic losses. Many were permanently destroyed, along with their records, inventory, and customer bases. For owners who survived, rebuilding seemed almost impossible amid the broader climate of fear and instability. Global markets reacted as well. Stock exchanges across Europe and Asia declined sharply, reflecting the interconnected nature of modern finance. Investors fled to safer assets, driving up the value of gold and government bonds, while riskier investments plunged. The insurance industry faced one of the largest payouts in history. Claims covered property damage, business interruption, life insurance, and liability, a financial burden that would take years to fully process. The scale of destruction challenged existing models for assessing catastrophic risk. Air travel restrictions compounded economic losses. With flights grounded, cargo shipments stalled, disrupting supply chains worldwide. Industries dependent on just-in-time delivery systems experienced delays that rippled through manufacturing and retail sectors. Unemployment began to rise as companies cut costs to survive the downturn. Thousands of workers in aviation, tourism, and related industries lost their jobs within weeks. The psychological impact of economic insecurity added another layer of distress to a population already grappling with trauma. Government leaders framed recovery as both an economic and patriotic duty. Consumers were encouraged to continue spending, to demonstrate resilience. Public messaging emphasized unity and determination, attempting to counteract the paralysis of fear. Over time, the attacks would reshape financial regulation, corporate risk management, and emergency preparedness across industries. Contingency planning became a central focus for institutions that had once assumed stability as the default state. The immediate economic shock served as a reminder that modern societies are deeply interconnected, that an attack on a single location can reverberate through global systems within hours, affecting livelihoods far beyond the physical site of destruction. In the aftermath of the attacks, the United States carried out one of the most sweeping reorganizations of its national security system in modern history. Agencies that once operated separately were pushed to coordinate, share intelligence, and act faster than ever before. Information sharing became the central priority. Investigators believed warning signs had existed, but were scattered across different departments that never connected the dots. Databases, communication systems, and operational procedures were integrated to reduce those dangerous gaps. The Department of Homeland Security was created, bringing together multiple federal agencies under one command structure. Its responsibilities included counterterrorism, border control, disaster response, cybersecurity, and protection of critical infrastructure. Airports, ports, rail networks, and public landmarks were reclassified as high-risk targets. Air travel experienced the most visible changes. New screening procedures were introduced almost immediately. Reinforced cockpit doors, armed air marshals on selected flights, limits on carry-on items, and the creation of the Transportation Security Administration. Flying, once routine, now carried an atmosphere of tension and scrutiny. Surveillance authority expanded significantly. New laws allowed broader monitoring of communications, financial activity, and digital behavior. Supporters argued these tools were necessary to uncover hidden networks operating within civilian populations, while critics warned about the erosion of civil liberties. Intelligence agencies shifted from reactive investigations to proactive prevention. Analysts began tracking travel patterns, suspicious transactions, and online activity that might indicate radicalization or planning. Counterterrorism was no longer just a military issue overseas, but a domestic responsibility as well. Local police departments also transformed. Federal funding provided advanced equipment, specialized training, and coordination through joint task forces linking federal, state, and local authorities. The goal was rapid response to complex, large-scale attacks. Public spaces were redesigned with security in mind. Government buildings added barriers, surveillance systems, and controlled entry points. Large events adopted multi-layered screening, and urban planning increasingly considered blast resistance and evacuation routes. Emergency preparedness campaigns urged citizens to remain vigilant and report suspicious behavior. The phrase, "If you see something, say something," became part of everyday language, reflecting a cultural shift toward shared responsibility for safety. International cooperation intensified as well. Allied nations expanded intelligence sharing on suspected extremist groups, travel movements, and financial networks, recognizing that modern threats operate across borders. Yet this transformation carried psychological consequences. Constant alerts and visible security measures reinforced the feeling that danger could appear at any moment. For many, security became a permanent condition rather than an invisible background. The new system reshaped the relationship between governments and citizens. Protection took precedence, even as debates over privacy and freedom continued. A balance that would define public policy for years to come. In the days following the attacks, the question was no longer whether the United States would respond, but how. Intelligence reports increasingly pointed to Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, operating from Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime. The focus of national grief and anger began shifting toward accountability. President George W. Bush addressed the nation and made it clear: those who carried out the attacks and those who harbored them would be held responsible. The message was direct and uncompromising. This would not be treated as a traditional criminal investigation alone. It would be an act of war. Congress moved swiftly, with overwhelming bipartisan support. Lawmakers authorized the use of military force against those responsible for the attacks. It was a defining moment, granting the executive branch broad authority to pursue terrorist networks across international borders. Diplomatic efforts began alongside military preparations. The United States demanded that the Taliban government in Afghanistan surrender Osama bin Laden and dismantle terrorist training camps operating within its territory. The Taliban refused, denying involvement and resisting external pressure. Behind the scenes, military planners prepared for a complex campaign in a region known for its harsh terrain and long history of resisting foreign intervention. Afghanistan's mountainous landscape, combined with decentralized militant networks, presented unique challenges. This would not be a conventional battlefield. Allied nations expressed support. NATO's invocation of Article 5 translated into tangible cooperation, including intelligence sharing, logistical support, and military contributions. A coalition began to form, reinforcing the idea that the response would not be unilateral, but collective. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Airstrikes targeted Taliban positions, Al-Qaeda training camps, and strategic infrastructure. Cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions struck key locations under the cover of darkness. For Americans watching from home, the images of explosions in distant mountains signaled the beginning of a new era. The war on terror had officially begun. It would not have a clearly defined battlefield, a uniformed enemy, or a predictable timeline. Troops were deployed to Afghanistan, working alongside local anti-Taliban forces. Early operations achieved rapid territorial gains, forcing the Taliban out of major cities. Yet, Osama bin Laden evaded capture, slipping into remote border regions. As the conflict unfolded, it became evident that this would not be a short campaign. Counter-terrorism evolved into counterinsurgency. Nation-building efforts followed military objectives. The mission expanded beyond retaliation to include stabilization and reconstruction. For many families who had already endured unimaginable loss, the war brought complex emotions, a desire for justice intertwined with fear of prolonged conflict. The nation had crossed a threshold. The attacks of September 11th had not only taken lives, they had set in motion a global military engagement that would shape international politics for decades. As military operations intensified in Afghanistan, the scope of the response began to widen. The phrase "war on terror" entered official vocabulary, signaling that the campaign would not be limited to a single country or battlefield. It was framed as a global struggle against extremist networks wherever they operated. US forces, alongside coalition partners, dismantled several al-Qaeda training camps and disrupted communication channels. Many operatives were captured, others fled across borders into remote regions of Pakistan. Yet the decentralized nature of the network made complete elimination difficult. Cells operated independently, inspired by ideology rather than direct command. Intelligence agencies expanded covert operations beyond Afghanistan. Financial tracking programs targeted funding streams linked to extremist groups. Banks were required to report suspicious transactions, and international cooperation aimed to freeze assets connected to terrorist financing. Meanwhile, attention increasingly shifted toward Iraq. US officials argued that Saddam Hussein's regime posed a potential threat due to alleged weapons of mass destruction and possible ties to terrorist organizations. The debate sparked controversy, both domestically and internationally, dividing public opinion and straining alliances. In 2003, the United States led a coalition invasion of Iraq. Baghdad fell within weeks, and Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. However, the absence of confirmed weapons of mass destruction and the rapid emergence of insurgent violence complicated the mission. What was expected to be a swift stabilization evolved into prolonged conflict. The war on terror was no longer confined to mountains in Afghanistan. It stretched across deserts, cities, and intelligence operations spanning multiple continents. Military deployments increased, and defense spending rose significantly. At home, public support initially remained strong, driven by memories of the attacks. Over time, however, questions emerged about strategy, costs, and long-term objectives. Casualties mounted, both military and civilian, adding layers of complexity to the narrative of justice and security. Globally, extremist groups adapted. Some aligned themselves with al-Qaeda's ideology, while others operated independently, but drew inspiration from its tactics. The threat landscape became more fragmented, harder to predict, and increasingly digital as online recruitment expanded. The war on terror reshaped geopolitics. Alliances were strengthened in some regions and strained in others. Military doctrines evolved to address asymmetric warfare, counterinsurgency, and intelligence-driven targeting. What began as a direct response to a single day of devastation had transformed into a broad, ongoing campaign without a clearly defined endpoint. The world was adjusting to a new paradigm, one in which conflicts were fought not only on battlefields, but in financial systems, cyberspace, and the realm of ideology. In the years following the attacks, daily life in the United States changed in visible and invisible ways. Security became a constant presence. Airports introduced rigorous screening procedures, long lines, and strict limitations on what passengers could carry. Armed federal agents, surveillance cameras, and reinforced cockpit doors became standard safeguards. A new government department was created to coordinate domestic security efforts. Its mission was to prevent future attacks by integrating intelligence, border control, emergency response, and infrastructure protection. This marked one of the largest reorganizations of federal agencies in modern American history. Public spaces also adapted. Government buildings, financial centers, and major landmarks increased physical barriers and monitoring systems. Emergency drills became routine in schools and workplaces, teaching citizens how to respond to threats ranging from evacuations to lockdowns. At the same time, debates emerged over civil liberties. Expanded surveillance powers allowed authorities to monitor communications and financial transactions more closely. Supporters argued these measures were necessary to prevent terrorism, while critics warned about potential overreach and erosion of privacy rights. Muslim and Middle Eastern communities in the United States experienced heightened scrutiny and, in many cases, discrimination. Hate crimes increased in the immediate aftermath, prompting calls for tolerance and unity from civic leaders. Community outreach programs attempted to bridge divides and counter radicalization through dialogue, rather than suspicion. Economically, the attacks triggered instability. The airline industry suffered severe losses, tourism declined, and insurance markets faced unprecedented claims. Government intervention helped stabilize key sectors, but recovery took years. Culturally, the attacks influenced media, art, and public discourse. Themes of vulnerability, patriotism, and resilience appeared across films, television, literature, and music. Memorial ceremonies each year reinforced a shared sense of national remembrance. For an entire generation, the attacks became a defining moment, a before and after in American history. Children who were too young to understand the event grew up in a world shaped by its consequences, where security announcements, identification checks, and global conflict were normalized parts of everyday life. The psychological impact was profound. Fear of future attacks lingered even as time passed. Yet alongside that fear emerged a narrative of endurance, the belief that the nation had been wounded but not broken. In the years that followed, Columbine did not fade into history. Instead, it became a dark reference point, a blueprint that disturbed experts and law enforcement alike. Investigators began noticing a chilling pattern. When new school attacks occurred, many perpetrators mentioned Columbine directly, studied it obsessively, or sought to surpass its death toll. The tragedy had transformed from a single event into a contagious idea. This phenomenon became known as the Columbine effect. Unlike spontaneous violence, these later attacks often involved careful planning, symbolic dates, manifestos, or recordings intended for posthumous discovery. The attackers were not only committing murder, they were performing for an imagined audience, seeking notoriety, recognition, or a sense of power they felt denied in life. Psychologists pointed out that media saturation played a complicated role. While public awareness is necessary, intense coverage can unintentionally elevate perpetrators into infamous figures. Their names, images, and writings circulate endlessly online, creating a mythology that vulnerable individuals may internalize. For some, the attackers appear less as criminals and more as symbols of rebellion or revenge. Online communities amplified this danger. Message boards, forums, and later social media platforms allowed isolated individuals to find others who shared anger, alienation, or fascination with violence. In some corners of the internet, the perpetrators were discussed not with horror but with admiration. This digital echo chamber blurred the boundary between analysis and idolization. Law enforcement agencies began monitoring warning signs more closely. Threat assessment teams were formed in schools to identify concerning behavior before it escalated. The focus shifted from reacting to violence toward preventing it, understanding that most attackers leak their intentions in subtle ways long before they act. Yet prevention proved difficult. There is no single profile that predicts who will commit such acts. Some perpetrators were bullied, others were not. Some struggled academically, others excelled. Some came from unstable homes, others from supportive families. The absence of a clear pattern meant that danger could hide behind normal appearances. Columbine left behind not only grief, but uncertainty. The unsettling realization that modern violence could spread through influence as much as ideology. The tragedy forced society to confront a painful question. How do you stop an idea once it takes root in the human mind? Before Columbine, the standard police response to a school shooting resembled hostage protocol. Officers would secure the perimeter, wait for specialized units such as SWAT, and attempt negotiation if possible. The priority was containment. Columbine proved how dangerously outdated that approach was. While authorities waited outside, the attackers inside continued moving, shooting, and planting explosives. In the aftermath, law enforcement agencies across the United States conducted painful reviews of their procedures. The conclusion was stark. When an active shooter is present, time is the enemy. Every minute of delay can mean additional casualties. The mission could no longer be to contain. It had to be to stop the killing immediately. This led to the development of the Immediate Action Rapid Deployment Strategy. Under this doctrine, the first officers on scene do not wait for backup. Even a single officer is trained to enter the building and move toward the sound of gunfire. The objective is simple and uncompromising. Locate and neutralize the shooter as fast as possible. Training shifted dramatically. officers began practicing solo entry, small team formations, rapid room clearing, and movement through chaotic environments filled with injured civilians. They learned to bypass wounded victims temporarily if necessary, prioritizing the elimination of the threat above all else, a decision that can be emotionally devastating but tactically essential. Coordination with emergency medical services also evolved. Rescue task forces, composed of police protection and paramedics, were created to enter warm zones sooner rather than waiting for a fully secured scene. This change aimed to reduce preventable deaths from treatable injuries such as blood loss. Communication systems were upgraded as well. Columbine exposed failures in radio interoperability, command structure confusion, and lack of real-time information sharing. Modern protocols emphasize unified command centers, clearer chains of authority, and continuous situational updates. These reforms have since been credited with saving lives in later incidents. In several cases, rapid intervention stopped attackers before they could reach higher casualty counts. Yet the new tactics also carry sobering implications. Officers must be prepared to confront extreme violence instantly, often without full information and with enormous personal risk. Columbine reshaped policing not just operationally, but philosophically. It forced a shift from reactive crisis management to proactive threat termination, a recognition that in the face of an active killer, hesitation can be lethal. In the wake of Columbine, the national conversation quickly turned toward gun control. For many Americans, the massacre exposed alarming gaps in how firearms could be obtained, particularly by minors or through intermediaries. Investigations revealed that the weapons used in the attack had been acquired through a combination of private sales and purchases made by others on behalf of the shooters, highlighting weaknesses in background check systems at the time. Advocates for stricter gun laws argued that easier access to high-capacity firearms made mass casualty events far more lethal. They pushed for measures such as mandatory safety locks, expanded background checks, restrictions on large-capacity magazines, and tighter regulation of gun shows, where private sellers were often not required to conduct checks. Several proposals gained traction at both state and federal levels, though many faced intense political resistance. Opponents of new restrictions emphasized constitutional protections and argued that law-abiding citizens should not lose rights because of criminal acts committed by others. They maintained that enforcement of existing laws, mental health interventions, and school security improvements would be more effective solutions than additional firearm regulations. This divide reflected a broader cultural conflict in the United States over the role of guns in society. Some legislative changes did occur. Laws requiring child safety locks for handguns gained support, and certain types of high-capacity ammunition imports were restricted. Retail policies also shifted. Major companies faced public pressure regarding the sale of firearms and ammunition, leading some to voluntarily limit or discontinue certain products. Despite these changes, Columbine did not produce sweeping nationwide reform. Instead, it intensified an already polarized debate that continues decades later. For many families affected by gun violence, the tragedy became a symbol of the urgent need for action. For others, it reinforced concerns about government overreach and the importance of self-defense rights. Ultimately, the policy outcomes were fragmented, varying widely by state and political climate. What remained consistent was the recognition that the issue was deeply complex, involving not only legal questions, but also cultural identity, public safety, and differing interpretations of freedom itself. In the months and years following the tragedy, the community surrounding Columbine struggled with a grief so profound that ordinary language often seemed insufficient to describe it. Funerals became collective gatherings of sorrow, attended not only by families and friends, but by strangers who felt personally shaken by what had happened. Vigils illuminated the night with thousands of candles, each flame representing a life lost and a future erased. Students who returned to school faced an environment permanently altered by trauma. Classrooms that once symbolized routine and normalcy now carried invisible weight. Many survivors reported feelings of guilt for having lived when others did not, a psychological burden that would linger for years. Counseling services expanded dramatically, and mental health professionals worked to help students process fear, anger, confusion, and loss. As time passed, the community sought a permanent way to honor the victims. Plans for a memorial began to take shape, driven largely by families who wanted a space dedicated not to the perpetrators, but to the lives that had been taken. Fundraising efforts stretched over several years, fueled by donations from across the country. The process itself became part of the healing, a collective act of remembrance and resilience. When the memorial was finally completed, it stood not as a monument to violence, but as a sanctuary for reflection. Visitors could walk through quiet paths, read the names of the victims, and contemplate the individual stories behind each one. Personal tributes, letters, and flowers were often left behind, transforming the site into a living testament of love and memory. For many families, however, closure remained elusive. Anniversaries reopened emotional wounds, and media coverage frequently reignited painful memories. Some chose to speak publicly about their loved ones, determined that they be remembered for who they were rather than how they died. Others withdrew from public attention, seeking privacy as the only path toward healing. Columbine did not simply fade into the past. It became part of the community's identity, a defining moment that reshaped lives in ways both visible and invisible. Yet within that enduring shadow, there also emerged stories of compassion, solidarity, and quiet courage, reminders that even after unimaginable darkness, people continue searching for light. In the years that followed, Columbine ceased to be only a place. It became a symbol, a shorthand reference for school violence that resonated far beyond Colorado. News reports, academic studies, and political debates repeatedly invoked the tragedy as a turning point, a moment when the illusion of safety in American schools was permanently shattered. Researchers began to document what would later be called the Columbine effect, a disturbing pattern in which future attackers cited the event as inspiration. Some perpetrators studied the details obsessively, analyzing tactics, timelines, and media coverage. Others referenced the shooters directly in writings or recordings, seeking notoriety or a sense of belonging to something infamous. This phenomenon alarmed experts, who warned that saturation coverage could unintentionally amplify the attacker's legacy. At the same time, Columbine entered popular culture in complex and often controversial ways. Films, documentaries, novels, music, and television episodes explored the tragedy from multiple perspectives: investigative, psychological, and artistic. Some works aimed to honor the victims or understand the causes of violence, while others were criticized for sensationalism or for centering the perpetrators. Musicians referenced the event in lyrics, sometimes as social commentary on alienation, fame, or gun culture. Authors used fictionalized versions of school shootings to examine themes of trauma, adolescence, and moral responsibility. Even video games and online communities occasionally engaged with the subject, sparking debates about ethics, freedom of expression, and the boundaries of representation. The internet accelerated these cultural reverberations. Online forums and later social media platforms enabled people across the world to discuss, analyze, and memorialize the tragedy. Support groups formed for survivors and grieving families. But darker corners of the web also emerged, where fascination with the attackers sometimes blurred into admiration, a development that deeply troubled researchers and law enforcement. Despite these controversies, many educators and activists attempted to redirect public attention toward prevention. Programs promoting empathy, mental health awareness, and early intervention gained momentum. The hope was that understanding the broader cultural impact of Columbine might help prevent future violence rather than perpetuate it. More than 2 decades later, the event continues to shape conversations about youth, media, and society. Columbine became not only a historical tragedy, but also a cultural reference point, one that forces each new generation to confront uncomfortable questions about violence, isolation, and the responsibility of communities to protect their young. In the aftermath of the tragedy, grief was accompanied by a relentless search for accountability. Families who had lost children, siblings, and loved ones turned to the legal system, hoping that answers might be found where explanations had failed. Lawsuits were filed against multiple parties, the school district, law enforcement agencies, and even the families of the perpetrators, each case attempting to determine whether the massacre could have been prevented. At the time, Colorado law placed strict limits on how much compensation could be awarded in lawsuits against government entities. This meant that even in cases of profound loss, financial settlements were capped at amounts many families felt could never reflect the true cost of what had been taken from them. Still, the legal process became one of the few available paths toward recognition and closure. Most claims against the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and the school district were dismissed in federal court under governmental immunity protections. Officials argued that despite the tragic outcome, their actions fell within the scope of emergency response procedures. For many families, these rulings felt like another blow. Not only had they lost loved ones, but the system seemed unable to hold anyone institutionally responsible. One case, however, stood apart. The family of teacher Dave Sanders pursued legal action after evidence showed that emergency medical personnel had been prevented from entering the building for an extended period, even after authorities believed the shooters were no longer active. Sanders had been critically wounded while helping students escape, and questions arose about whether faster medical access might have saved his life. The case was eventually settled out of court for a significant sum, avoiding a prolonged public trial. Additional lawsuits targeted individuals who had supplied the firearms used in the attack. Investigations revealed that the weapons had been obtained through intermediaries, exploiting gaps in background check laws and private sales regulations. Settlements were reached with several parties, including those who had purchased or transferred the guns, acknowledging a degree of responsibility without formal admissions of guilt. Some families accepted these settlements as a pragmatic step toward healing, while others rejected them, feeling that no financial agreement could substitute for justice. In one notable instance, a family initially refused a settlement, but was later ordered by a judge to accept a reduced amount. These legal outcomes underscored the complex intersection of grief, law, and public policy. Ultimately, the courtroom battles did not provide definitive answers about why the tragedy occurred. What they did reveal was the difficulty of assigning responsibility in an event shaped by numerous failures, personal, institutional, and societal. For many survivors, the legal chapter closed without the sense of resolution they had hoped to find. In the years that followed, the tragedy reshaped not only a community, but an entire nation's understanding of school safety, youth violence, and collective grief. Columbine became more than the name of a school. It became a symbol, a reference point invoked whenever similar acts of violence occurred. Each new incident reopened old wounds, reminding the public that the questions raised that April Day had never been fully resolved. Memorials were created to honor the victims and preserve their stories beyond the headlines. At Clement Park near the school, a permanent memorial was built as a place for reflection, a quiet landscape of engraved stones, personal tributes, and open sky. Survivors, families, and visitors gather there not only to mourn, but to remember lives defined by far more than the way they ended. Inside the rebuilt library, where so many of the lives were lost, the atmosphere was intentionally transformed. Light, openness, and calm replaced the darkness of memory. The space became both functional and symbolic, a declaration that learning, not fear, would define the future of the school. Over time, Columbine also entered the cultural consciousness in complex and sometimes troubling ways. Books, films, music, and academic studies attempted to interpret the event, each offering a different lens through which to understand what had happened. Some works focused on the victims and survivors, while others examined the perpetrators, sparking ongoing debate about whether such attention risks granting notoriety to those responsible. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in the lives of the survivors. Many carried invisible scars, trauma, anxiety. Survivors' guilt, long after the physical wounds healed. Yet many also became advocates, speakers, counselors, and voices for change, determined that their experiences would serve a purpose beyond tragedy. For a generation of students across the United States, school safety drills, lockdown procedures, and heightened security became a normal part of childhood. What had once been unthinkable gradually became routine, illustrating how deeply the event altered everyday life. Decades later, the story of Columbine is not simply about violence. It is about memory, responsibility, resilience, and the enduring effort to understand how such a tragedy could occur and how it might be prevented in the future. The names of those lost continue to be spoken, not as symbols of fear, but as reminders of lives that mattered, dreams interrupted, and a community forever changed.